Welcome to Religion 3367, Islamic Faith and Society. Today, we are actually going to combine some chapters together in this lecture, and there's a reason for that. The reason is that the topic of the biography of the Prophet Muhammad, which is dealt with in chapter 4 of a new introduction to Islam under the title The Life of Muhammad, as well as chapter 6, the tradition literature, which deals with something called the Ḥadīth, have a considerable amount of overlap in terms of the actual substantive subject matter with which they deal, namely the life and the person, if you will, of the founder of Islam, the Prophet Muhammad. I will begin by focusing more or less on topics in chapter 4, and we'll address some of the topics in chapter 6, and then I will have a standalone lecture for chapter chapter 5, which is devoted to the Quran, the holy book or sacred scripture of Muslims, of the Islamic faith, the religion of Islam. So this chapter is pretty straightforward, the life of Muhammad, chapter 4, and I am not going to address specific issues which are already dealt with in the chapter, which you can read yourselves, namely things such as the Battle of Badr, very important battle in the history of Islam, the Battle of Uhud, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. All of these are dealt with from pages 68 to basically the end of the chapter, which is 68 to 72, which is basically the end of the chapter, and then the basic facts of the life of the Prophet Muhammad. What I would like to address instead is in some detail, in fact, are the sources of the life of the Prophet Muhammad, which are extremely complicated, extremely complex, and the author of the textbook does try to address some of these matters, but I wanted to give you a little bit more detail and more, shall we say, texture in order to understand what is at stake, and there is a lot at stake. So first and foremost, there is no real dispute as to when the Prophet Muhammad died. He died in the year 632 of the Common Era. That's one way of referring to the calendar we use now in most of the world. So right now it's obviously 2023 Common Era. The more religious way, so to speak, to refer to those dates is AD. And before that is referred to as BC. So BC stands for before Christ. AD, unlike what a lot of people think, does not stand for after death. It stands for the Latin phrase Anno Domini, which for Christians, it's a Christian designation because it means the year of our Lord. The Lord, of course, being Jesus Christ, who is central figure, obviously, in Christianity, and is considered to be the Son of God and God incarnate as well, and so on and so forth. So one less sort of religious way of referring to that for people, who want to avoid any even unconscious religious commitment to Christianity, they will say Common Era, and so you find that in many books. So the Prophet Muhammad died in the year 632 CE or AD. I don't really have a big stake in which of those you like. I'm just using both we don't want to offend anyone. When he was born is subject to some uncertainty. The sources of Islam, the indigenous Arabic and Islamic tradition, holds that the Prophet Muhammad was born in something called the Year of the Elephant. Okay, what does that mean? I'll explain that in a moment, but we can determine that the Year of the Elephant, quote unquote, was either 570 Common Era or AD or 571. So it's either 570 or 571. We're not entirely sure. There's some uncertainty. So what's the year of the elephant? Well, you have to understand that there is a certain degree of arbitrariness in terms of how we count years, in terms of how dates are reckoned. So you need a point of reference in time to start counting from, right? Imagine if you just wanted to measure distances, let's say. Well, you have to have a starting point and an end point. So if I want to know what is the distance between Santa Fe, New Mexico, for example, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, you have a starting point and an end point. And let's say then that we just start measuring everything from Santa Fe. Let's say we just love Santa Fe and we want to measure everything relative to how far away it is from Santa Fe. So Santa Fe then in this example would become our point of reference. So similarly, temporally speaking, when we talk about time, we need to take a point of reference and measure from there. You need a reference point. So for most of the people in the world today, for better or worse, we follow this calendar that's used in Western civilization, which we just deferred to, where you have the BC and the AD, or if you like, BCE, before Common Era, and CE, Common Era designation. And so supposedly that's when it begins with the birth of Christ. Actually, that isn't true. He was probably born sometime after, maybe around 4 CE, 4 Common Era, but I don't want to get into that. Simply, there is some pivotal event. So for Western civilization, Christian Western civilization, the birth of Jesus is a huge event, and that's how it's measured. So if you have a society that doesn't have a calendar system in which everybody agrees on things, then there's sort of pivotal events around which you date things. So the ancient Arabs did not have a calendar system, and they would count events they would reckon time, with reference to certain pivotal events. So they will say, oh, it was so many years after such and such a famous battle. One famous battle in pre-Islamic times was the Battle of Fijar. So they would say it was so many years after Harbul Fijar in Arabic, the war or Battle of Fijar, or so many years after Harbul Basus. Basus is the name of another, important battle that took place in pre-Islamic times. And so similarly, there's something called the Year of the Elephant, in which the city of Mecca was attacked by an army that came from the Yemen. Yemen by that time had become under the political domination of Ethiopia, or Abyssinia, the ancient name Abyssinia, and the ancient Abyssinian Christian capital of Aksum in Ethiopia. You can look on a map, look at an atlas. Almost nobody does that anymore. If you want to Google this, you can find a map. The ancient city of Aksum, which is spelled A-X-U-M, and some people spell it A-K-S-U-M. And so Yemen came under the dominion of this Abyssinian Christian kingdom. And this is mentioned in the book. So they wanted to promote Christianity. And so a giant cathedral was built, a giant church was built in Yemen to rival that of the ancient site of the Kaaba, which Arabian Islamic historical tradition ascribes to Abraham, having been refurbished by Abraham. And in fact, the belief is that it was built by Adam according to a heavenly or celestial prototype, and had become obscured and had been covered over by sand and so forth. And it was Abraham and his son Ishmael, according to this tradition, who refurbished and raised anew, as it were, the foundations of this sacred edifice. And this incident is referred to in the Holy Quran. So the Abyssinian envoy who was ruling Yemen, Abraha, built this church to rival the Kaaba to attract the Arabs. The Arabs in Mecca heard about it, and one of their prominent figures who had a kind of ritual function went to this church in Yemen and desecrated it. And I'm sorry to be indelicate, but he did so by, defecating in its premises. As a result, then Abraha decided to attack Mecca and destroy it. And for this purpose, he had an elephant brought over from the continent of Africa to the Arabian Peninsula to be incorporated in the army as a kind of ancient, shall we say, tank almost. And the incident is recorded in the Quran in a chapter known as Suratul Fil, or the chapter of the elephant. It's also mentioned in an ancient inscription, which survives to this day and is found in what is today the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So this expedition is mentioned, and the expedition didn't succeed. And anyhow, to get to the point, this became known as the Year of the Elephant, and it was that year that the Prophet Muhammad was born. And so that's either 570 or 571 of the Common Era, or Anno Domini, whichever you like. So how do we know any of this? Well, again, this comes down to sources. And I want to refer to a book which is very popular among English-speaking Muslims called Muhammad, His Life, based on the earliest sources. Now, this book mentions a lot of these early sources. So at the very back of the book, in the key to the references, he talks about the important sources that he's relied upon. But these are the most important standalone book that is devoted to the biography of the Prophet Muhammad is mentioned by Daniel Brown in here. And that is a book called As-Sīratun Nabawiyya, or the prophetic biography of the Prophet. And this book was written by someone named Ibn Ishaq. There are more fuller forms of the names of all of these ancient scholars, these past scholars I'm going to mention. We're just going to keep it simple and give the short form of the name, the most famous form of the name by which they're known. Arab names, Islamic names are complicated. They don't really work like Western names, like, a first name and a last name. So we'll just call him Ibn Ishaq. Ibn Ishaq means the son of Ishaq. Ishaq is the Arabic form of Isaac. He died in the year 150 of the Hijrah, which corresponds to 767 of the Common Era. So what is 150 of the Hijrah? So now here we come to another important point. The Muslims have a calendar. They have their own religious calendar. It's called the Hijrah calendar. And so just as for the Christians, the supposed date or year of the birth of Christ is the beginning of the calendar, for the Muslims, the pivotal or epochal event from which they date time from history itself is the migration, which is in Arabic for migration, the word is hijrah, the migration of the Prophet Muhammad from Mecca to Medina. The Prophet was born in Mecca, spent most of his life, early life there, and then he migrates, and then his followers come after him to a city about 300 kilometers to the north, 350 kilometers to the north, called Medina. And it's there he lives out really the last 10 years of his life and is buried there. And so this event is a turning point in the history of Islam, this migration, this hijrah, and so things are dated from there. So Ibn Ishaq died in the year 150 of the hijrah. So when was the hijrah according to the calendar we use now, which, by the way, is known as the Gregorian calendar? Well, that was in the year 622. And remember, he dies in 632. In Hijra years, the death date of the Prophet is 11 of the Hijrah. So Ibn Ishaq, the guy who compiles this biography, died 150 years after the Hijrah, and that corresponds to the year 767 of the Gregorian calendar of the Common Era. This work was a large work. It's a work in which the birth of the Prophet is situated against the backdrop of sacred history, beginning with Abraham. And there are genealogies. In that regard, it is, I think, very similar to the early books of the Hebrew Bible, namely the Torah, the Pentateuch, the early books of the Pentateuch, or the Torah, the first 5 books of what Christians call the Old Testament, what the Jews refer to as the Tanakh, or in English, the Hebrew Bible. So the accounts that you have, for example, in Genesis and particularly in Exodus, It's very similar. There's genealogies, and you find this in Ibn Ishaq. And so the work of Ibn Ishaq was a large work, and there was a lot of poetry in it as well, because for the pre-Islamic Arabs, their main form of literature, as I said in an earlier lecture, was poetry. And indeed, they immortalized their great events and great deeds of themselves and their ancestors in poetry, and this poetry was transmitted in oral form. So Ibn Ishaq wrote a lot of this poetry that was presumably relevant to this history of the life of the Prophet in this work. Now, here's the thing. Ibn Ishaq's original book, the biography of the Prophet, does not survive. Let me say that again. The original book by Ibn Ishaq, As-Sīra an-Nabawiyyah, the prophetic biography, does not survive to our times. It has been lost due to the vagaries of history. What we do have is an edited version by someone named Ibn Hisham. And Ibn Hisham comes much after Ibn Ishaq. Ibn Hisham died in the year 218 of the Hijrah, corresponding to 833 of the Common Era. So what did Ibn Hisham do? Well, we think that he mainly took out a lot of the poetry. He abridged the work. He made it much smaller. And so even though it doesn't survive, a good chunk of it does. But what exactly he edited out and where he edited, we don't know all of these places for sure. However, I should say that a portions of the original Ibn Ishaq, which we don't find in the edited version by Ibn Hisham, do survive as quotations in other writers. And the most important writer in this regard is someone who is known as Tabari, T-A-B-A-R-I, Tabari. Tabari is much later. He died in the year 311 of the Hijrah, which corresponds to 922 Anno Domini, or Common Era. So we've got Ibn Ishaq, Ibn Hisham, and then we've got Tabari, and there's some other sources as well. The other sources are a guy named Ibn Sa'd, and Ibn Sa'd died in 230 of the Hijrah, 845 Common Era. And then we've got a guy named Al-Waqidi. Al-Waqidi died in 207 of the Hijrah. 207 of the Hijrah. What is that? I have a conversion table for Hijrah to Christian dates. So 207 of the Hijrah is 822. There's sometimes a year plus or minus, but about 822. 822 of the Common Era. So we've got Ibn Ishaq, Ibn Hisham. They go together, sort of, because Ibn Hisham edited Ibn Ishaq's account. Then you've got Ibn Sa'd, then you've got Al-Waqidi, then you've got Tabari. And Tabari has a lot of quotations. Tabari has a lot of quotations from the unedited Ibn Ishaq. So we can say that around the 4th century of the Hijrah, roughly, going by the death dates, because Tabari died 311, so that's the 4th century of the Hijrah, 9th century Christian calendar. Sorry, 10th century Christian calendar. He died 922. So we can say that at least one copy of the unedited Ibn Ishaq was in circulation, and Tabari had access to it. So who is Tabari? Tabari is a very important historian. He wrote a massive universal history from the beginning of time, from Adam up until his time, and it goes by year. And so the early volumes deal with the life of the Prophet, but it isn't there that he's got the quotations from Ibn Ishaq. Tabari was a very prolific scholar, so his history, if you buy the modern edition, is about 10 volumes. I've got it in a big shelf downstairs. And he was also a commentator on the Quran. The Quran has a lot of commentaries written on it over the centuries, and he wrote a very important early and massive commentary Depending on which edition you buy, it's between 20, 25, 30 volumes, and there's different publishers and so forth. So that's why there's some variation in the number of volumes, but it's a big book. And it's there that he has quotations when he's commenting on verses from the Quran that have some relevance to, events in the life of the Prophet, his biography. He will have little snippets that he quotes from Ibn Ishaq. Now, if you're interested, the Ibn Ishaq Ibn Hisham biography of the Prophet has been translated into English. It's a big fat book. I think it's about 500-600 pages. It's called The Life of Muhammad, translated by the British French Orientalist. I think he was French origin, Alfred Guillaume. And what Alfred Guillaume did was that he went to Tabari's commentary on the Quran and cut out all of the and copied out all of the quotations from the original Ibn Ishaq and inserted them into his translation where he thought they would go. And wherever he has an insertion, he puts it between parentheses and introduces it by the letter T with a colon, and then he writes it in, and he closes the parentheses, and then he goes on. So in that regard, he has done people a service in the English language, so you do have access to all of this stuff if you want to follow up on it. Ibn Sa'd wrote a kind of biographical dictionary called the Book of Generations, or At-Tabaqat in Arabic. And there are a couple of different editions of that, both published in Beirut, if I'm not mistaken, in about 8 to 10 volumes, if I'm not mistaken. Again, these are large books. And so there will be volumes, and he doesn't really go in alphabetical order. He sort of goes chronologically, sort of. And so the biography of the Prophet, of course, is going to be at the front of that. And he's really important. And he studied with a guy named Al-Waqidi. And Al-Waqidi compiled a book called Kitab al-Maghazi, or the Book of Military Expeditions, which sets out the military exploits of the Prophet Muhammad. So these are the main sources. And then you've got all of these books, which are the books of Hadith. So the sources which I've mentioned are generally called the books of Sīra. Now, Sīra in general means biography, but in Arabic, it now is used almost exclusively to refer to the biography of the Prophet. And those biographical books, the Sīra books as they're called, are separate and considered different from, within the Muslim tradition, mind you, from the books of Hadith. So a Hadith is an account, and these accounts were originally oral, written down later, usually about a century or two later, although there was writing down of little micro events of the life of the Prophet in his lifetime. The Hadith generally are compiled about a century or two later, and they are then accounts of, which were originally oral, of a statement or an action or some sort of a tacit approval of the Prophet Muhammad. That's the Sunni definition. Among Shīʿah, they add to that and that it's an account not just of what the Prophet said or did or approved of, but whatever the Prophet plus Ali, the first Imam of the Shiites, all the way up to the 12th Imam. There's 12er Shīʿah, there's other kinds of Shīʿah. So it would include the statements, actions, and tacit approvals of all of these Imams as well, plus anything that the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad also would have said or done or approved of, which would be his daughter was one daughter in particular, and that's the daughter Fatima, and she was the wife of Ali. But there's almost nothing of that in the Shia Hadith literature. Is very little, because she died by almost all accounts very shortly or very shortly after the death of the Prophet Muhammad himself. So the Hadith are compiled into various books or collections of Hadith. There's a lot of them. So if we just run through the major collections, and this is how this lecture also sort of deals with the chapter on Hadith, which is chapter 6. So let's see, Hadith collections. So the most famous Hadith collection among the Sunnis, there's 6 books. There's the book which was compiled by Bukhari. And again, these guys have longer form names, but Bukhari is how it's known. Bukhari means somebody from the city of Bukhara, which is in present-day Uzbekistan. Then there's another one called Muslim. Bukhari died in the year 256 or 810, 870, sorry, of the Christian calendar. Hijrah is 256. Then there's the collection by someone named Muslim. That was actually his name. He died in 261/874. So I always give the Hijrah date and then the Christian date. Then there's a book called the Sunan of Abu Dawood. Abu Dawood died 275/888. Then there's the Jami' at-Tirmidhi. Tirmidhi, it's always by the author. Tirmidhi is the author. He died 279/892. And then there's the famous Nasa'i, who dies 303/915. And then there's Ibn Majah. Ibn Majah's collection. So Ibn Majah died 273 or 886. So you can see that all of these collections are pretty early if you go by the death dates. These guys all died, in the 200s or in one case the 300s of the Hijrah. So mainly the 800s or the 900s of the Christian calendar. In addition to this, there are Shiite hadith collections as well. The most important is called Al-Kafi, and that was compiled by a guy named Al-Kulayni, and Al-Kulayni died in 329/941. There's another one called Kitab Man La Yahduruhu Al-Faqih, and you're not responsible for these Arabic names. And that's compiled by someone named Ibn Babawayh, also known as As-Saduq. He died 381. That's about 991 of the Christian calendar. Then there's two others. You're not really responsible. It's not important to know the names. They're compiled by the same person named At-Tusi, or Muhammad ibn al-Hasan At-Tusi, who died in 460 or 1067. These are the sources which are extremely important. Martin Lings does not refer to Shiite sources in this book, Muhammad is Life Based on the Earliest Sources. So this is a very popular book. And I want to refer to this book just briefly to try and let you understand how complicated these sources are. These sources are not in the best condition. They often contradict one another. They often have varying accounts of the same event. And this also reflects the disagreements in the Muslim community some of the disagreements in the Muslim community that survive to this day, including the big split between Sunnis and Shi'as. And this is really important to understand. But it's not just among Sunnis and Shi'as. So Muslims have lots of things they need to do. Muslims pray 5 times a day. They fast once a year in a month called Ramadan. And these things like prayer and fasting, the pilgrimage to Mecca, giving a certain kind of charity, which is called zakat, they are all done according to rules, and the rules are pretty detailed. However, there are differences among Muslims about these detailed rules. And the reason is because there are different hadiths. Some hadiths say things maybe one way, another hadith maybe says it another way. So then it comes down to weighing the evidence. Which hadith do you think is more authentic? And so many of the debates in the Muslim community, whether it's between Sunnis or Shias, or between Salafis, very sort of literal-minded and maybe less literal-minded Muslims, it often always comes down to the interpretation of a hadith, accepting one hadith, rejecting another, regarding one hadith as weak, another as stronger, varying interpretations of the Quran as well. So these sources are extremely important, not just for historians who are maybe non-Muslims or neutral, historians, but also for practicing Muslims in their day-to-day life. And anyway, so I think that should be clear, really what's at stake here. But then there are other factors as well. So this book, and I'll try and illustrate that. This book is very, very widely circulated in the English-speaking Muslim community. Almost every Muslim in America probably has a copy of this book. And so people think that this is a really, accurate book, actually, but it's not. It's an overly simplistic account of the life of the Prophet Muhammad. And even though he says it's his life based on the earliest sources, Martin Lings nowhere explains how he decided between these sources. So I'll give you a simple example. Most people, and by most, well, let me phrase that again. Most Muslim people, i.e., most Muslim people will be most Muslims, which is Sunni Muslims. The majority of Muslims have a particular account of how the Prophet Muhammad died. And it's a very simple thing. You have to understand that these books like the Sīra and of Ibn Hisham, or the biography of Ibn Hisham, which is really Ibn Ishaq and the recension of Ibn Hisham, they often don't have like a running narrative. They'll have some sort of chain of transmitters, and you have the same situation in Ḥadīth. You'll have some guy who says, I heard it from so-and-so, who heard it from so-and-so, heard it from so-and-so, that the Prophet did XYZ. Okay? And so you often have different accounts. And so by way of example, Martin Ling says that when the Prophet Muhammad died, he died. He had an he wasn't feeling well. He was in his final illness, and he died lying down with his head in the lap of one of his wives, his wife Aisha. And the source that Martin Ling cites for this is Ibn Sa'd, the guy who died in 230/845. In other words, Ibn Sa'd's Book of Generations. Now, if you go and check that source, and there's two editions, you can check either edition, it doesn't matter. Two major editions that I know of. You will find that it's not that simple. You will find that there is one account that says he died whilst lying down with his head in the lap of Aisha. Another account in the same book, and I want to stress that Muhammad ibn Sa'd, this guy who died in 245, who died in 230/845, is a Sunni Muslim. There's absolutely no doubt he's a Sunni Muslim. But in that very same book, on the same page, or the other edition, it's the facing page, it says that he died while sitting up. And this is not a minor point, while sitting up and supported, with a hand behind him on his shoulder by Ali ibn Abi Talib. My question is, which was it? Can we even know? You have two completely different accounts, and Martin Lings only gives you one of them, and he doesn't tell you that there's another one. And he does that throughout the book. And he weaves together a narrative, which makes you think that these earliest sources on which he has based this book also present you with a connected, uncontroversial, uniform, and unanimous narrative, which Martin Lings has simply just read in the Arabic, digested, and written in actually very beautiful English. Martin Lings was a scholar of Shakespeare. He was a convert to Islam. I'm not really going to go into all the details. It's not relevant, but I knew the man sort of, meaning I met him 3 or 4 times in my life. Had interesting conversations with him. He was British. He was what at the time was a position called the Keeper of Oriental Manuscripts at the British Museum. That's no longer what it's called. Those things are no longer in the British Museum. They're now in the British Library, and the title of the person who runs the Arabic manuscript division there is something else. It's just obviously another person now. Martin Lings died some years ago. So Martin Lings, he had a PhD in Islamic studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies, and he was a convert to Islam. He was a Sufi. We'll talk about Sufism later in the course, and this is the book he put together. So he gives you sort of a false impression of what the Sīra is actually like. And so there are many points of controversy in the Sīra. And, Daniel Brown has focused very much on these. And there is one in particular, which I think comes later in the chapter on the Quran. And that has to do with what is called the satanic verses. My, where is this? Maybe it's not in that chapter. Maybe it's in the Sīra chapter. All of these have run together in my mind at this point. The night journey. the Hijrah. So there is an incident. I'm just seeing if it's in the index. 64. So it is in the Sīra chapter on page 64. It was during this period of intense disputation that later biographers placed the now infamous story of the satanic verses. Ibn Ishaq himself makes no mention of the event. And this is just wrong. Ibn Ishaq does. And we know that because Tabari quotes it. He goes on to say, but Tabari recounts traditions to the effect that Muhammad, under severe pressure to compromise, came up with verses which offered an accommodation with the Meccan pantheon. Well, Tabari came up with them because he's quoting them from Ibn Ishaq. So Daniel Brown is wrong here. So there's a famous incident in the life of the Prophet, or in the Sīra literature, which is supposed to be the so-called incident of the satanic verses. So I want to give you sort of a understanding then of the complexity of the Sīra literature, or the biographical literature of the Prophet, by spending some time on this question. And I have dealt with this at great length in my book, Fatwas of Condemnation, Islam and the Limits of Dissent. And I'm actually just going to read, which is the published version of my PhD thesis. So I'm just going to read portions of that to you to simplify the matter. So the satanic verses refers to some phrases which are said to have been interpolated into the text of the 53rd surah of the Quran, Surah An-Najm. Najm means the star, under supposed demonic inspiration, only to be removed shortly thereafter, it is said, when the Prophet Muhammad became aware of the satanic meddling with the Holy Writ. The source of such accounts is the Kitab al-Tabaqat, or the Book of Generations by Muhammad ibn Sa'd. Remember, he died 238-45. The historian and commentator on the Quran, Muhammad ibn Jarir al-Tabari, this guy named Tabari, who died 311-922, also speaks of the incident both in his History of Prophets and Kings, his historical work, Tarikh al-Rusul wal-Maluk, and his commentary on the Quran, which is known as Jami' al-Bayan fi Ta'wil Ayat al-Quran, or the comprehensive exposition in interpreting the verses of the Quran. So if you go to the source in Ibn Sa'd, who's the earlier of these two people, he's before Tabari. And if you go to the account that's preserved by him in his Book of Generations, you find that supposedly or presumably due to the rejection of his preaching, the Prophet secretly wished that Allah, that God, not send down to him any revelation that would further estrange him from his people. One day, the Prophet Muhammad joined the notables of the Quraysh tribal confederation in one of their customary gatherings near the sacred shrine of the Kaaba, and he proceeded to recite the revelation which had come to him, which was the 53rd surah, Surah An-Najm. And here's how it reads in my own translation. By the star when it sets, your comrade errs not, nor is he deceived, nor does he speak of his own desire. It is nothing but an inspiration that is inspired, which one of mighty powers has taught him, one vigorous, and he grew clear to view when he was on the uppermost horizon. Then he drew near and came down until he was distant 2 bows' length or even nearer, and he revealed unto his slave, capital H, God revealed to his slave, Muhammad in other words, that which he revealed. The heart lied not in seeing what it saw. In other words, he sees this revelation, it's revealed on his heart. And then the Quran says, will you then, addressing the non-believers, will you then dispute with him concerning what he saw? And indeed, he saw him yet another time by the cedar tree, Sidratul Muntaha, the cedar tree of the utmost boundary, near unto which is the garden of the abode. When that which shrouds did enshroud the cedar tree, the eye turned not aside, nor yet was overbold. Indeed, he saw one of the great revelations of his Lord. And here the Quran says, have you thought about Al-Lat and Al-Uzza and Manat, the third, the other? So Lat, Uzza, and Manat are the names of 3 pre-Islamic goddesses revered by the pre-Islamic Arabs as the daughters of God. Now, it's at this point that Satan is supposed to have put two verses into the mouth of the Prophet in praise of these three idols, Lat, Manat, and Uzza. And that was in Arabic, تِلْكَ الْغَرَانِيقَ الْعُلَى وَإِنَّ شَفَاعَتَهُنَّ لَتُرْتَجَى, which is that they, in other words, Lat, Manat, and Uzza, are the high-flying cranes or water birds. Truly, their intercession is to be hoped for. Now, it is in reference to these pagan Arabian goddesses that the incident is known in Arabic as the Qissatul Gharaniq, or the tale of the high-flying cranes. Reciting these two so-called satanic verses, the Prophet is said to have continued his recitation of this chapter to the end. That is to say, from verses 21 to 62. The 62nd verse contains the command, prostrate yourselves before Allah and serve him. And it's at this point, Ibn Sa'd informs us in his account, that the Prophet Muhammad, along with all of the people who were there, among the notables of the non-Muslims of Quraysh, they are all said also to have bowed their heads down onto the ground in adoration of God. One of the people present, who is named Al-Walid ibn al-Mughira, along with someone named Uhayha Sa'id ibn al-As, due to the infirmities of old age, who could not bow down their heads, picked up symbolically some earth and placed it on their head, indicating their obeisance. So Ibn Sa'd tells us that some say, Ibn Sa'd then goes on to say that that these opponents of Islam are to have taken this supposed satanic verses, these two supposed satanic verses, to be a concession to the intercessionary status of these three goddesses. Excuse me. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Sorry. So they saw this supposed interpolation as a kind of concession on the part of the Prophet to the pre-Islamic Arabian polytheistic idolatrous cult. And it is said then in this source that they then voiced their readiness to accept the Prophet's teaching due to this seeming compromise. At this point, we are told, according to Ibn Sa'd, that the Prophet Muhammad felt distressed by this and went to his house. Later that evening, he's visited by the Archangel Gabriel, to whom he recites the surah along with the so-called satanic verses. And at this point, the angel Gabriel rebukes him and says, I didn't come to you with these two phrases. And the Prophet is to have admitted the interpolation, saying that I ascribe to Allah what he did not say. Ibn Sa'd then ends this extraordinary account with the even more extraordinary assertion that at that instant, the Prophet is said to have received the following revelation from another chapter of the Quran. And indeed, they strove hard to beguile you, Muhammad, away from that wherewith we had inspired you, that you should invent other than it, in other words, other than the Quran, against us, and that then would they have accepted you as a friend. And if we had not made you wholly firm, you might have inclined unto them a little. Then had we made you taste a double punishment of living and a double punishment of dying, then you would have found no helper against us. So the news of this supposed conversion of the Quraysh is said in the same source, Ibn Sa'd, to have spread throughout Mecca and to have reached all the way to Abyssinia. And in Abyssinia, or Ethiopia, a group of Muslims had left Mecca because of persecution and had settled in Abyssinia. When they supposedly received this news, they returned to Mecca, and as soon as they reached the outskirts of the city, Ibn Sa'd tells us that by then the Prophet Muhammad had already, been corrected by Gabriel, and they received that news, and then they made an about face, went back to Abyssinia. Now, the weird thing is that Ibn Sa'd, again, you have to remember, they have sources. They say, and who is reciting this? Who is telling him this? Someone named Muhammad ibn Umar, who claims that the incident occurred in the month of Ramadan in the 5th year of the Prophet's preaching. Not in the 5th year of the Hijrah, the 5th year of the Prophet's preaching. Hijrah hasn't happened yet. He's in Mecca. And that the immigrants to Abyssinia had departed Mecca in the month of Rajab of the same year. And that they spent the next 2 months of the calendar of Sha'ban and Ramadan in Abyssinia, and that they returned to Mecca the following month of Shawwal upon hearing of the Quraysh's conversion. So you have to know a little bit about the Muslim calendar and the months. But this assertion alone casts doubt on the authenticity of Ibn Sa'd's account, because the surah makes explicit references to experiences that took place during what is called the ascent or the Mi'raj, an event which Ibn Sa'd himself dates 18 months prior to the Hijrah. That is to say, sometime in the year 11, not the year 5 of the Prophet's message or mission. So there's a chronological problem already. Now, if you look at Tabari has an account. He gives two accounts. In its essentials, both of these accounts match that of Ibn Sa'd, but there are some differences which you have to look at more closely. The first account in Tabari indicates that those assembled near the Kaaba included a group of Muslims. And upon the reciting of the so-called satanic verses, this group of Muslims is said to have made no comment or exhibited even the slightest surprise. And at the end of the surah, all of them are to have bowed their heads onto the ground, Muslims and non-Muslims alike. And the wording of the satanic verses is not consistent in either of the two accounts in At-Tabari. The Arabic is different. I don't want to go into all of the details, but instead of la turtaja, they have la turtada, which doesn't change the meaning too much, but it's a very different word. And that's in the first account in Tabari, and then the second account in Tabari matches what's in Ibn Sa'd, except again there's a variation in the Arabic, and again I don't want to go into all the details of Arabic because guys, really, most of you who are maybe attending this class probably don't know Arabic. So the more important point is that Tabari's second account informs us that after being rebuked by Gabriel and receiving the revelation of the Quranic verses also quoted in Ibn Sa'd, the Prophet was greatly saddened until another further revelation from another surah called Suratul Hajj was sent down to exonerate him. Whereas the first account only mentions the verses from Surat al-Hajj and not the verses from Surat al-Isra. So this is all very complicated. And this revelation from the Surat al-Hajj, if we read that, and this is the translation of Muhammad Marmaduke Pickthall, he says, "Never sent we a messenger or a prophet before thee, but when he recited the message, Satan proposed opposition in respect of that which he recited thereof. But Allah abolisheth that which Satan proposeth. Then Allah establisheth his revelations. Allah is knower wise." In Arabic, and here the Arabic is important, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَا مِنْ قَبْلِكَ مِنْ رَسُولٍ وَلَا نَبِيٍّ إِلَّا إِذَا تَمَنَّى أَلْقَى الشَّيْطَانُ فِي أُمْنِيَّتِهِ فَيَنْسَخُ اللَّهُ مَا يُلْقِي الشَّيْطَانُ ثُمَّ يَحْكُمُ اللَّهُ آيَاتِهِ وَاللَّهُ عَلِيمٌ حَكِيمٌ. Okay, so that's Surah Al-Hajj is the 22nd chapter of the Quran. That's verse 52. Now, both accounts in Tabari tell us that upon receiving this revelation, the satanic verses were abolished or abrogated from the Quran. And then the Quraysh resumed their opposition. It is telling that in his commentary on the Quran, Tabari discusses the tale of the high-flying cranes not while commenting on the surah known as the Star or Surah Al-Najm, but in his comments on this verse from Surah Al-Hajj, the 22nd surah of the Quran, and gives a number of other accounts of this tale, the tale of the high-flying cranes, from other narrators. So if you look in the very old, Bulaq or Cairo edition, that's in volume 17, pages 131 to 136. It seems to have become customary among commentators on the Quran to discuss the tale of the high-flying cranes in reference to this verse of the Quran, perhaps in imitation of Tabari. The interpretation given to the verse is unusual to say the least. So the word where in Arabic is tamanna, and that's what Pickthall refers to as recitation or reading. But the word tamanna actually literally means to hope. But it has a metaphoric sense of to recite. And many of the early Sunni commentators took the metaphoric sense to read or recite, which is how Pickthall interpreted it. The rationale for such a reading is provided, in their view, by the word naskh, which means to abolish or erase or abrogate, to abolish, erase, render null and void, repeal, invalidate, abrogate, and so on and so forth. And then they refer that back to the tale of the high-flying cranes, as though this is a case of some sort of an abrogation. And there is a theory of Quranic abrogation, especially important in Sunni jurisprudence. And the theory of abrogation is very controversial among Sunni Muslims as well. The Shia generally reject this kind of Sunni idea of abrogation, and they completely reject out of hand the tale of the high-flying cranes. But this theory of abrogation of certain verses of the Quran has had its influence on various translations of the Quran. And no doubt through the inevitable reliance of translators such as Pickthall and others on the Arabic commentary tradition, it finds its way into their translations. Now, it's very interesting that there is a study by John Burton, who was of St. Andrews University in Scotland, in which he persuasively argued at great length that the tale of the high-flying cranes was in fact concocted by partisans of this theory of abrogation. And he has a whole book, in fact, in which a lot of this is dealt with, called The Collection of the Quran, which is worth reading. But a discussion of this whole argument is obviously beyond the scope of this class. Suffice it to say that this whole interpretation is very, very fishy and problematic on the original, Arabic text of the Quran, not to mention the chronological problems and other problems which I'll talk about in Ibn Sa'd's account. But if we just look at this verse, tamanna really means to hope. And so really that verse should be rendered as follows: we never sent any messenger or prophet before you except that when he wished good for his people, tamanna, Satan cast obstacles in the path of realizing his hope, but Allah renders not, null and void as it were, invalid, whatever Satan may cast, so to speak, and makes firm his signs, for Allah is all-knowing and all-wise. This is my translation. So when this verse, which is portrayed by most Sunni commentators as being revealed specifically in reference to the incident of the so-called satanic verses, when it's seen to be nothing more than a comment on the hardships faced by all prophets and all who were charged with the office of divine envoy, of conveying a message from God, rather than a reference to satanic meddling with the Quranic text. So coming back then to the actual alleged account of the tale of the high-flying cranes, an even stronger argument against its historicity is the text of the surah itself, the 53rd surah, Surah An-Najm, the very surah in which the satanic verses are said to have been inserted. So if you recall that in the accounts of Ibn Sa'd and Tabari both, the recitation of the surah is to have continued all the way to the end of the surah, and that those who were present there are all said to have bowed down or prostrated themselves upon hearing the last verse. In other words, prostrate yourselves before Allah and serve him. This satanic interpolation is to have occurred between verses 20 and 21. Verses 19 and 20, which are there in the Quran, mention the three pagan goddesses. They say, have you thought upon Allat and Al-Uzza, and Manat the third, the other? Then you have so-called satanic verse 1. They are the high-flying cranes. Then satanic verse 2. Truly their intercession is to be hoped for. It is then followed by the rest of the verses. Verse 21, after so-called supposed satanic verse 2, says, are yours the males and his the females? That indeed was an unfair division. I'll explain this in a moment. Then in verse 23, it says, they, namely the idols, Lat, Manat, and Uzza, are but names which you have invented, you and your fathers, for which Allah has revealed no warrant. They follow but a guess, and that which they themselves desire, and now the guidance from your Lord has come unto them. So verses 21 and 22, are yours the males and his the females? That indeed was an unfair division. That is a reference to the pre-Islamic Arab practice of sometimes killing infant daughters by burying them alive, as the birth of a daughter was regarded as inauspicious. So on the one hand, the Arabs have this practice of killing their daughters, but on the other hand, they think that God should have daughters. So these verses point to what the Quran sees as an inherent duplicity and hypocrisy of pre-Islamic Arabian society, which on the one hand disdained infant daughters to the point of burying them alive, but in its pagan cult instituted an intercessionary gynecolatry by ascribing daughters to Allah. Hence, verse 22, that was indeed an unfair division. And verse 23 clearly denounces this idolatry as a concoction of the Arabs and their forefathers having no divine sanction whatsoever. So the so-called satanic verses, if indeed they were there, they don't even fit the context, because on the one hand, these idols are being praised, and on the other hand, they're being denounced in the 3 verses that come thereafter. And then finally it says, now the guidance from your Lord has come unto you, at the end of verse 23. And then verses 24 through 62 continue in this fashion, denouncing the pagan Arabian cult and urging the pre-Islamic Arabs to avoid the enormities of sin and abomination of idolatry, in other words, and mentioning that the ancient peoples of Ad and Thamud, in addition to those of Noah, Nuh, and Lut, are given as examples of people who were destroyed because of their idolatry. And then the surah concludes with mention of the impending doom of the day of judgment, saying in verse 57, the threatened hour is nigh or near. None beside Allah can disclose it. Marvel you then at this statement, and laugh and not weep while you amuse yourselves. And the final verse, verse 62, rather prostrate yourselves before Allah and serve him. So it's patently obvious that the satanic verses in praise of the goddesses simply make no sense with the rest of the surah, which contradicts them in no uncertain terms, and thus casts considerable doubt on the historicity of the episode. The pagans of Mecca could never have construed the 2 satanic verses as a concession to their intercessionary cult in the context of the entire surah, and much less have prostrated in obeisance. The accounts of the tale of the high-flying cranes in the primary sources are also highly spurious, to say the least. The famous Italian Orientalist Leon Caetani from the early part of the 20th century rejected this entire tale after a thorough analysis of all the source material. That's in his 10-volume Annals of Islam, Anelli del Islam, published in Milan between 1905 and 1926. The same conclusion was arrived at by a large number of Muslim scholars, such as Bayhaqi, Qadi Iyad, Badr al-Din al-Aini, al-Hafiz al-Mundhari, al-Nawawi, and so on. In addition to the accounts of Ibn Sa'ad and al-Tabari, there are 8 others known to me, bringing the total to 10. Each of these 10 accounts is associated with the name of a particular person who transmitted it. These 10 narrators are, listed. So I'm not going to give you a whole list of their names, but there's only one of them who was a companion of the Prophet. In other words, the other 9 were never even present. And they can be held to have been sort of concocted this, or the story was concocted and ascribed to them. And the only one who was a companion of the Prophet Muhammad, and therefore theoretically or in principle could have been present, is someone named Abdullah ibn Abbas. Abdullah ibn Abbas died in the year 68 of the Hijrah. '68 of the Hijrah, which is very early. So 68 is about the year 687 Common Era. So all the rest of them are from the generation after the companions. So none of them could have had firsthand eyewitness knowledge of the supposed event. As for Abdullah ibn Abbas, he is to have been born 3 years before the Hijrah. Hijrah was in 622. Christian calendar, 3 years before that. And Ibn Abbas was 13 years old at the time of the death of the Prophet. So the Prophet dies in the year 632 or the year 11. Ibn Abbas died in the year 68 of the Hijrah. I already said it was 687, I think. And he was 71 years old when he died. We know how old he was when he died. So that would mean, if we take the date of the tale of the high-flying cranes as being in the 5th year of the Prophet's preaching, assuming what was in Ibn Sa'ad is true, which is problematic, that corresponds to, just for the sake of argument, 8 years prior to the Hijrah. And so there is no way that Ibn Abbas could have been present. If we take the event to have been sometime after the Mi'raj, which we know was about 18 months before the Hijrah. At that time, Ibn Abbas is almost a newborn infant. Hence, the account ascribed to him, like the accounts ascribed to the 9 other narrators, are all spurious and established that the tale of the high-flying cranes is pure fiction. On the basis of arguments like the foregoing, and the belief on their part in the inerrancy of the prophets, Shia Muslims have always categorically rejected the tale of the high-flying cranes. So you can see how these sources continue to be relevant in inter-Muslim disputes and also in disputes with non-Muslim so-called Orientalist scholars of Islam who love this story. Just to conclude, to say that the accounts of the Satanic Verses incident are rather peculiar would be an understatement. Indeed, it was the famous British Orientalist Sir William Muir who called it one of the strangest episodes in the life of the Prophet. Now, I've argued already that the chronological discrepancies in the accounts of the tale of the high-flying cranes in Ibn Sa'ad's Book of Generations, and the possibility elaborated at length in the works of John Burton, suggests that the entire event was concocted by partisans of a particular theory of abrogation in Islamic jurisprudence. Moreover, the impossibility of any of the narrators to have witnessed the event and the fact that the Satanic Verses in praise of these pre-Islamic Arabian goddess figures is in complete contradiction to the rest of the text of the Quran in that chapter, not to mention the message of Islam as a whole, indicates that this whole thing is very, very doubtful, just actually, I think, impossible. And therefore, I conclude that it has no historical basis whatsoever and is pure fiction. So that shows you really what is at stake here in these sources, how complex they actually are, and just how absolutely simplistic a book like Martin Ling's Muhammad is Life based on the early sources. And of course, he rejects the idea of the Satanic Verses, and it doesn't make an appearance here. But there's a lot of things which we simply do not know about the Prophet Muhammad's life with any certainty. On the other hand, there is a lot of stuff which we do know because there's a lot of material, a huge amount of material. It's not like even the life of a modern person. I mean, if you take a modern figure, let's just take like famous leaders, a US president, or even someone like Adolf Hitler. I mean, that's sort of really awful example to give. Very, evil figure in history. But his life has been studied to death, right? But we don't have his life, for example, or a US president or some famous celebrities in the detail that we have of the life of the Prophet. So the Hadiths give very detailed accounts, very micro accounts of things that he did, what his favorite foods were, how he dressed, how he wrapped on his turban, how many different sort of weapons did he have? He had different swords, he had different bows. All of this stuff is mentioned, and there is some differences of opinion and so forth. But in terms of the sheer amount of, shall we say, raw data that we have on the life of the Prophet, I really doubt that we have that kind of raw data for anybody in history. Now, it's another matter how accurate it all is, but at least we've got this raw data, and people can look at it, and we can argue, and we can disagree, and so forth. And that's exactly what's missing from this book. And even though Daniel Brown tries to give you some inkling of what that is, he obviously, thinks that the Satanic Verses is probably very, important and so forth. And so there's a lot of stuff which you don't get from his book as well, which is why I wanted to go in some detail here. So much for the Sīra. In terms of other events in Islamic history, there are other examples that could be given on the basis of Ḥadīth, for example. So I'll point you to another video, which was actually a lecture, not really a lecture, it's a video I recorded a couple years ago. It's not like this lecture. It was intended more for a sort of Muslim audience, but I think it's still useful. Since it was intended for a Muslim audience, I speak slightly differently there, using certain pious phrases and so forth. So please do keep that in mind. So there is a famous incident that took place in the history of Islam, and that is the events which took place in the year 61 at Ashura, on the date of the 10th of Muharram. namely the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, who was the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad. And that is something which is very important for Shia Muslims and is not really does not really have the same significance, if any, for Sunni Muslims. But the date of the 10th of Muharram for Sunni Muslims, for other reasons, which they claim, is an important date, and people are supposed to fast on that date. Shia Muslims don't do this. So Muharram is the first month of the Islamic calendar. And it is claimed that when the Prophet Muhammad came to Medina, he encountered the Jews who were resident in Medina, so this is after the Hijrah, and that the Jews would fast on the 10th day of Muharram, which is called Ashura. Ashura just means 10, basically 10 or 10th, something like that. And then when he encountered them fasting, he said that the Muslims are more worthy of fasting on this day than the followers of Moses or the Jewish people, the Banu Israel, the children of Israel. And so he instituted this fast. Now, what's the basis for that? Some hadiths. Those hadiths are in Bukhari. Are those hadiths really accurate? You know, do the Jews today, and these are people who very tenaciously, and I would say admirably, cling to their religious tradition. I can respect that. I respect people, you know, who really stand up for their beliefs, and they, you know, wherever they live, they sort of maintain their religious practice. If they're religious Jews, there are Jews who are not religious. We understand that. There are Muslims who are not religious. There's all Christians who aren't religious. But my point is that they really stick to their rituals, and so forth. Well, is there some fast that they engage in? They don't follow the Muslim calendar. Why would they follow the Arab calendar? Is there such a fast? Really, there isn't. Does it have any connection with Yom Kippur? These are questions that need to be asked, but they aren't asked. So I made a video in which I argued that there actually is no historical basis for the fast on Ashura. And I think you should watch that after this as another example of the complexity. This is more related to hadith sources of, you know, the raw data or material on the life of the Prophet Muhammad. So I will post out on the link to that in Canvas, and I think you should have a look at that. I'm sorry this video was a kind of a long one, but these issues had to be addressed. I do hope you find it useful. Thank you very much.